Hi everyone, today I'm going to be reviewing Race the Sands by Sarah Beth Durst. This was a recommendation that was put into my Magic TBR hat by a viewer, Angela McAllister. She recommended this and I drew it out of the hat for my February TBR. So if you guys would like to suggest titles for me to potentially read, you can put them, go back to my last TBR video where I solicited recommendations, and I'll leave a link to that TBR in the description for this video as well. So I've been trying to put in a few recommendations every month from viewers, and then I'll pick a few things out of the hat blindly and add those to my TBR. So this was a book that wasn't really on my radar. I think I had heard of it once. I had maybe kind of heard of the author, but I didn't really know anything about Sarah Beth Durst, and I didn't really know anything about this book either. So Sarah Beth Durst has published a lot of books. It seems like she writes for adults and teens and also children's books, which is kind of interesting. You don't see that many authors that are writing successfully in all of those age ranges. Overall, I really enjoyed this book. I read it in one evening and it was just kind of a fun read. I didn't love everything about it, but it was definitely enjoyable and entertaining. I don't know if I will read more books by this author or not, but she does have a new release called The Bone Maker, I think, which just came out, and I think that actually looks pretty interesting. So I'll go a little more into depth, but basically what I liked about this book was the plot, and where it didn't quite work for me was more the writing. But I think it's a book that other people might enjoy the writing style more than I did. It just was a kind of writing that is something that isn't my favorite, at least not right now. So the plot of this book is one that you've probably encountered before because it's a pretty classic plot. You have a grizzled older trainer who has sort of a murky past with maybe some scandals and some sports failures, but now she really needs to win the championship this year for financial reasons and also to reclaim lost glory. And then you have the young rider who is, trying to make her own way in the world, and she has family issues and is trying to prove herself. And then, of course, you have the steed who is wild and untrainable and has actually killed somebody before, and everyone thinks that this creature can't possibly be trained or ridden, but it does happen to be really fast. So the twist here is that I'm not talking about horses, and it's not a sports story. They are actually racing monsters. And these monsters are in a world where the religion is dominated by the fact that when you die, you get reincarnated as something else, and only the very, very best people get reincarnated as people. Everyone else gets reincarnated as animals, but what kind of animal you get reincarnated as depends on basically how good a person you are. So if you're the very, very worst kind of person, you get reincarnated as this monster called a Kehawk. And these monsters are what people, for some reason, like to race. So there's a big event every year where people are racing these things, and the winning monster gets to get reborn as a human due to a special charm that it wins from the priesthood, basically. It's an interesting look at a religious concept. It's honestly a little bit, maybe almost Calvinistic, because it seems like people are kind of predestined to either be reborn as something good or something bad, but that's definitely something that gets explored in this book, and it was kind of a nice concept. I don't think the world building in this book was incredibly in-depth. It focuses on maybe a few key aspects, but it was definitely an idea. I hadn't seen a world that was completely focused on reincarnation like this before, so it was definitely an original idea in what's obviously a very standard story. But the thing about this story is I'm not complaining at all that this is a standard plot. I think that's kind of the whole point. And I loved seeing that twist, the monster twist on a plot that is so beloved. I think I mentioned in a video before, when I was pretty little, I loved horse books about horse racing, a few classics. I mean, there are things like The Black Stallion. I feel like this is kind of the plot of The Black Stallion also, like maybe not completely, but there are so many stories, and also there's so many sports stories that basically have this exact narrative. You have the coach that used to be great, but now he's down on his luck, and he recruits a team of misfits that turn out to be the championship team. Like that, this is basically that story. And we all love that story, right? Like there are so many good versions of that story, and we kind of know what's coming. You know kind of how it's going to end. You know there will be some twists along the way, but I think we love to root for a sports underdog. It's just something kind of innate. I know there are infinite movies, many of which are very good, that are basically following this plot. So seeing that with a fantasy twist, I thought that was kind of ingenious. Like I mentioned before, my favorite thing about this book was the plot. I love how Sarah Beth Durst used this classic plot. There were just enough twists and reveals, some of which actually surprised me, some of which I saw coming, but others I didn't really expect. I thought the pacing was really good. Because it is such a familiar story, it doesn't waste too much. So, speaking of twists, we just had a fire alarm. Nothing to worry about. It happens in this building a little too often. I think the smoke alarms are extra sensitive, so whenever anyone decides to smoke in their apartment or, burn some toast. Yeah. So let's see if I can remember what I was talking about. I think I was talking about twists and pacing. And I think I was saying that I felt like because it is such a familiar and well-loved plot, the author was able to not take too much time on the parts of the story that were familiar and sort of focus on having twists and having really tight pacing, which made this a very enjoyable book to read rather quickly in one evening. I mean, it's long. It's like a 500-page book, but it's pretty easy to get through. It's pretty light, honestly. I wasn't that invested in the characters, to be honest, but I was invested enough in the plot that it really just kept me reading, and I wanted to see how things were going to turn out. Even though with this story, there are only really a few options for how it can end up, which is either they win or they barely lose, but they gain something more important. And I'm not going to say which one it is in this book. It doesn't really matter. You'll have to read it for yourself. But either way, it's like you kind of know reading this story where the story might end up, and it's more about twists along the way, which I think that she did a pretty good job of. Where this book didn't really work for me was the writing style, and that's maybe more an area of personal preference. It's not that the writing wasn't good, but the voice of this story was very casual, contemporary, more than I really like. I don't want my fantasy necessarily to be written in old-timey, faux historical language or anything like that, but I like to not have it feel too contemporary in a way that just makes it feel, I don't know, not authentically in another world, if that makes sense. It just, for example, you have characters just saying things like fun times or expressions like that just do feel very modern. But it was also just part of the voice of the book. Like, it was quite consistent. It wasn't that the author was breaking her own style with things that felt out of place, which I know is something that authors have to be pretty careful of. It was more just that the overall voice and style of the writing just didn't entirely work for me. It definitely did feel bordering on the writing style you would find in young adult books. I know this is technically marketed as adult, and it doesn't have some of the genre conventions that you do expect in YA. You guys probably know I'm not a huge YA reader, but I'm fine either way. Like, you could consider this to be YA, you could consider this to be adult, but just the writing style was a little bit too YA for me, I guess, although there are YA books that don't read like this. That was probably the biggest flaw to me, the thing that really kept me from getting immersed in this story. Even though I cared about the story, I wanted to see what happened, I didn't quite get into it because of the writing. The only other things that I didn't really care for in this book, I thought in the end there were too many points of view. There were two main ones, which worked for me. You had the trainer and the rider, but then there were a couple other characters that were introduced, and they weren't really important to the story. But I feel like 4 points of view is a bit much for a book that is this length and sort of this light, to be honest, where it felt like some of the role of those characters was just to convey information. They didn't necessarily, one of them had an arc, another one he was the emperor to be, his older brother was the emperor who had just died, and so now the new emperor can't be crowned until they find the animal that's the reincarnation of the previous emperor, and that hasn't been found, so this Prince Dar just hasn't been able to be crowned yet. He was a likable character, but it's just he didn't really have that much of a character arc. He was just there to show an aspect of the plot that the other characters wouldn't have been around because of where they are in society. So for me, I would have loved if the author had found a way to convey that story arc, that part of the plot, without adding a point of view that didn't add a ton to the story. The other point of view character was an older priest, and he definitely did add something else to the narrative, but it just felt like just a bit too many characters. I've really started to feel like I'd rather see a couple of really well-written points of view rather than a ton, and I think that these days people like to put in a lot of points of view. I also felt like there was a portrayal of court politics and scheming in this that to me was a little bit superficial. That was also an area where the book felt a little bit more YA to me, like everything was a little bit on a more of a teenager level and how these characters were interacting and handling things. And I know I've just come off reading some pretty convoluted political books. Like I just finished reading A Desolation Called Peace, which was the sequel to A Memory Called Empire, and there were some very complex politics and power maneuvering in that series. So I don't know. I didn't think that really added too much here, but the things that I was more neutral on were the characters, which I said they were fine. I liked them well enough. Didn't really do anything for me. Didn't really irritate me either. They served the purpose of conveying the story. I felt like they were all kind of pretty archetypical, but not in a bad way. And like I said, the world building, it had some really fun, interesting ideas. The whole world and society didn't feel super fleshed out to me, and I really love some good immersive world building with a sense of depth. But I did appreciate, I felt like this was fresh, even though it wasn't deep, if that makes sense. So overall, this was a pretty enjoyable, digestible read. I'm not necessarily going to go out of my way to recommend it to people, but I also feel like if you want something that's just a story that you know you love, something that's fun, something that's easy to read, this is a really nice way to spend an evening. And I'm actually really glad I read it. Like I said, I'm kind of neutral on whether I would like to read more by this author or not, but I probably would try at least one more of her books. I would just pick it when I was in a mood for something where I just wanted to sit down, read a book in an evening, and just something that didn't require too much focus. So thanks so much for watching, guys. If you've read this book, let me know what you think. Or if you've read other things by this author, I'm curious to know how typical this was as a Sarah Beth Durst book. I'm curious to know how typical this is as a Sarah Beth Durst book. I think she has a trilogy called The Queens of Renthia, which is also adult fiction, and she had a book just come out called The Bone Maker. So let me know if you guys have read any of those, and thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.